Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of the Dads in Timeout Sports Show. This is your host, Jesse Williams, aka J Will, aka Jesse James the Outlaw. And I am finally back with another podcast, and I am happy to say that we are done with the NBA Finals. And I'm not saying that I'm happy that we're done with the NBA Finals because I don't like covering the NBA Finals, but I had a lot of difficulties being able to watch a lot of these games because of, well, not having cable. And then, of course, I was gone doing some Army stuff, and then they sent me home because I got exposed to somebody with COVID. Don't have COVID, thank goodness. And so the internet was real bad, and we were trying to stream the game, but I was able to stream most of the game last night, and it was a good game, let me tell you. And so I took some notes to talk about some things to put in context this series. But first off, congratulations to the Milwaukee Bucks, first title in 50 years. Congratulations to Giannis for having one of the all-time great finals games with 50 and I think 14 rebounds, and he was hitting all but two of his free throws. Shout out to the Fear the Deer and to all the people that are Milwaukee Bucks fans. I think this is great for the NBA. And I really am happy. I know I was kind of rooting for Chris Paul to win the NBA Finals just because I think that Chris Paul has had an extraordinary career, and I think that this would have been icing on top. But we'll get to Chris Paul here in a minute. But I want to be clear that whatever I say going forward is not an indictment on the Bucks. The Bucks had the opponents in front of them with whatever was going on, and the Bucks took care of business. And everybody that I know was picking the Suns to win this series. And so congratulations to Milwaukee. They didn't have home court advantage. They're missing Dante DiVincenzo, and they won the championship. They won it fair and square. And I think it is a testament to both Giannis and that organization, and even Coach Bud to an extent. So now let's get to what I really feel. Not that I don't stand by those statements I made, but let's talk about this for real. So we can all agree, I think, that these were not the best teams out of either conference going into the playoffs. The Suns might have a closer case, but if the Lakers are healthy with Anthony Davis and LeBron James, because that series still went 6, I think it's a totally different series. LeBron obviously wasn't right, and AD was hurt for several games in that series and then was limited when he was on the court. Once again, not the Suns' fault. If Kevin Durant has a smaller foot, the Nets win that series. He hits that shot, the game is most likely over unless a miracle happens. Now, those things did not happen. So with the Lakers, they did get hurt, and with the Nets, Kyrie got injured, and Kevin Durant was basically by himself with Joe Harris, who played like crap that entire series, with Blake Griffin, who was okay, and with James Harden on one leg, who couldn't hit a three-point shot to save his life. So it's interesting because people always think when you bring this kind of stuff up that you're hating. And it's not that I'm hating, I'm just putting things in their proper context. So when you say things like, oh, this is one of the greatest finals wins of all time, let's go ahead and put Giannis in the top 10 all time, things need to be placed in their proper context. That doesn't mean there's an asterisk. The Milwaukee Bucks won the NBA championship. They won the NBA championship because Giannis figured some things out. They were the healthiest team minus their one injury, and they exploited a matchup, which we will get to. And so even if these weren't the two best teams, it still made for a very intriguing finals. The only player that had finals experience in the entire finals was Jay Crowder. So you had new blood. You had CP3 going for his legacy-defining ring. You had Giannis trying to make that next step with 2 MVPs, a Defensive Player of the Year award in the finals. Devin Booker, an emerging superstar. We'll get to him. And a very well-liked coach in Monty Williams, and a very often criticized coach in Coach Budenholzer. So people on Twitter, they're like, you just hating, man. Like, you just hate. It's like, I'm not hating. It's just these things actually happened. So let's look at the Phoenix Suns. In the first round, they beat the Lakers in the first round. Anthony Davis is hurt. I still think they could have won that series, but who knows? Okay. In the second round, they're playing the Denver Nuggets with Jokic and a bunch of dudes. No Jamal Murray, no Will Barton, no Gary Harris. Michael Porter Jr. is obviously injured. In the conference finals, there's no Kawhi Leonard. Now, they still won, and they still got to the finals, and they still went up 2-0. So that's fine. Let's just keep things in their proper context. And that goes to my next point. The Suns never figured out how to stop Giannis. They never really built that wall. I kept seeing Jay Crowder on him. DeAndre Ayton was just getting schooled by the end of the series. And at some point, he was just drawing fouls because he's not afraid to miss at the free throw line. That's a great thing about Giannis is he's not afraid of the moment. And so it's something to be commended on Giannis's part, but the Suns had 6 games and never really slowed Giannis down. He had the slow first game when you could tell that the hyperextended knee was bothering him. After that, I mean, he averaged 35 in the series and only scored 20 in game 1, if that tells you anything. Obviously, he had the 50-piece. He had back-to-back 40-point games, back-to-back 40 and 10 rebound games, which everyone's like, oh, it's only been done a couple of times, which is true. Giannis was absolutely fantastic. Middleton showed up when they needed him to, and Jrue Holiday was great on the defensive end. That goes to another thing about the Suns. Rebounding. They were getting killed on the boards routinely in this series. They were getting smoked on the offensive glass. And I don't know how many times I watched this series and watched guys simply just not box out, which is fundamental basketball. And it was really frustrating from someone who grew up playing basketball and watching basketball that it's one of the easiest things in the world. And the Suns never figured that out. And so the rebounding killed the Suns. And so Milwaukee's guards matched up very well with CP3 and Booker. By the end of the series, Booker could not get his shot off against Chris Middleton. Chris Paul, which is another point that I'm going to make later about the mid-range, could get to his spots, but it's almost as if Milwaukee was like, okay, well, if Chris Paul's going to beat us. But Chris Paul didn't have an epic game in this series where he went for 35 or 36 and he took over the game. He averaged like 22, and I don't even know how many assists because I didn't look it up. But it was just one of those things to where I thought their guards would match up well. I didn't think they'd match. Now, don't get me wrong. Booker still had 2 40-point games and a 30-point game, but he also had some duds. He could not shoot the 3 consistently. And then we'll get to the Suns and why I feel like this isn't as crushing of a loss for them. And the offense, the Phoenix Suns offense just lacked movement at times. It was a lot of Booker going one-on-one, and it was a lot of just drive and kick. They didn't throw the ball around as much. And some of that is Dario Saric got hurt. Some of that is Chris Paul would go one-on-one, and then Booker would go one-on-one. And they just didn't have the ball movement that I saw earlier in the playoffs from them. And I think that was a key factor to why they lost. And I already talked about how the Bucks never figured out the mid-range game. Phoenix just didn't consistently hit him. Jeff Van Gundy on the telecast last night made a great point. Chris Paul could get that free throw line mid-range jumper anytime he wanted. And it looks like his legs were just a little tired. And so they happened to win this series even though they never figured that out. Like the Suns, if the Suns could just hit the mid-range. Now, also in Game 2, they hit 1 billion threes, and so it helped that they cooled off from 3. Both teams shot the 3 very badly last night. So Coach Bud Coach Bud is now an NBA champion, and we were firing the guy 3 weeks ago. If he would have lost to the Nets, and I think even to the Hawks, I think they would have fired him. Well, you can't fire him now. He just won a championship. Reminds me a lot of Frank Vogel. Not that I think Vogel would have got fired, but nobody was like, oh, Frank Vogel's this outstanding mastermind of a coach, and then he wins a title. And so now you're like, okay, well, he has an NBA championship. It's not a fluke. But we saw so many times in the playoffs where the adjustments weren't being made. But I thought that playing Bobby Portis more minutes was a good adjustment. But Bud was still out here playing Jeff Teague high minutes, who gave them absolutely nothing. Like, I'm not going to say Jeff Teague is washed. I'm going to say that Jeff Teague's better days are behind him. And it was evident in this series that he was basically a zero. Connaughton played well enough at times, but he was streaky. they really needed DiVincenzo in this series, even though they won. I think that it would have taken a lot of pressure off of Middleton, off of Holiday, who shot really badly this series. Both teams had weak benches. Now, like I said, Donte DiVincenzo was hurt for the Bucks, and Dario Saric was hurt for the Suns. But why the Suns had no backup center on their roster, or even a power forward that can play big minutes, is really concerning. And goes back to the first point I make about putting things in context. If you look at championship teams, they have guys like last year. The Lakers had Dwight Howard and JaVale McGee that could come off the bench and spell Anthony Davis. I mean, JaVale McGee started, but they had multiple bigs they could throw at teams. They had multiple guys that could handle the ball. Rondo, LeBron, Alex Caruso. And then they had KCP and just guys that could shoot off the bench. The Suns were basically their starting five, Cam Johnson and Cam Payne if he was okay. Frank Kaminsky was a huge liability. And I know he gave them good minutes last night, but if you're asking Frank Kaminsky to be one of your rotational players in the NBA Finals, congratulations that you got this far, but at the same time, we're still talking about you're putting yourself in a pickle. Bryn Forbes didn't play almost at all this series. Jeff Teague, we already mentioned, was a 0. Pat Connaughton was up and down. And then you had Bobby Portis, who played really well, but Bobby Portis is the 6th best player on the championship-winning team. And that's not a shot at Bobby Portis for all you Arkansas fans out there that are going to go nuts about what I'm saying. And so I just think that when we watch the NBA Finals, and a lot of people on Twitter just lack context. A lot of people in the media lack context. They just look at the box scores like, oh, he was trash. And it's like, well, how are the teams constructed? Milwaukee won this series because they had more guys that could go on spurts, right? So Chris Middleton could have a huge quarter, and so could Drew Holiday. Drew Holiday had a 16-point quarter in one of the games in this series. Connaughton could splash threes. PJ Tucker was virtually a 0 on offense. The Suns, if Booker or Chris Paul were off, they were going to lose. Ayton hasn't proven that he can consistently do it down low yet. But here was the point I wanted to make about the Suns. So the Suns last year went 8-0 in the bubble and still didn't qualify for the playoffs. And that was a great run. And then they add Chris Paul. And so everyone was like, oh, well, who before the season, raise your hand, was thinking, oh, Chris Paul to the Suns makes him a championship contender. We thought it gave him a chance. But with the Lakers and the Nuggets and the Jazz and the Clippers, those teams were all favored above the Suns before the season started. And then they go and get the number 2 seed. But so you basically took a team that still had a losing record after winning 8 straight in the bubble, in the play-in, to adding a 36-year-old Chris Paul, and they got to the NBA Finals. This team hadn't been to the playoffs in 10 years. So while we're like, oh, wow, it's disappointing that Chris Paul didn't come through in another big moment, as for the Suns, most teams don't go from not in the playoffs to going to the finals. It's usually a progression. A great example is Oklahoma City Thunder. Though they never won a title, they lost in the first round, they got to the second round, they got to the conference finals, they lost in the finals. Then they went to another conference finals, and then Durant leaves, and then they can't get out of the first round. Now they're rebuilding. And the only exception would be super teams, right? So they put this team together like LeBron and them, and they go straight to the finals. But this is a team full of guys who had no playoff experience, really. And then they add Jay Crowder, and they add Chris Paul, and all of a sudden they're in the finals. And people are like, oh, this is the best team in the West. And it's like, but are they really? They took advantage of the circumstances in front of them, which they are to be commended for. But let's not get it twisted and act like, oh, well, the Phoenix Suns are now this juggernaut. People were talking dynasty when they were up 2-0, and now they didn't even win the championship. So here's the question now. Chris Paul, like every other human being, is only getting older. And you kind of saw that he hits a wall. And even though he took this franchise to heights they hadn't been to since Charles Barkley in '93, are you going to pay Chris Paul $40 million? Now, he has the player option, which he's probably going to decline. If he takes the player option, he's back. Or do you try to get a different piece? Because one thing about the Suns is that the Western Conference is going to be tough. If Dame stays in Portland and they make a move, they're right there in the lower half of the playoff standings. You've got the Lakers, who I'm sure are going to make a move. You've got the Nuggets with Jamal Murray coming back by the playoffs next year. The Jazz are going to be fully intact. I don't know about Mike Conley. And so the West is going to load back up. You're going to see whatever the Golden State Warriors do once Klay Thompson comes back, and whatever they do with those 2 lottery picks. Memphis is still a factor. Memphis is a very sneakily good young team. Let's say they add a veteran. Let's say they add a key free agent that takes them over the top and gets them out of the first round. Like, are the Suns, because everybody, I remember when the Suns were playing, I remember when the Suns were matched up with the Lakers, everyone was like, oh, it's such a bad draw for Chris Paul. We feel so bad for him. The Suns are just going to get rolled over in the first round. And honestly, when the Lakers were up 2-1, it looked like that. It really did. It looked like, okay, LeBron figured it out. They're going to steamroll this series, and then something changed, right? So just to assume that to assume that the Suns should be here and should have won the title is putting a lot of expectations on Devin Booker, who had never been to the playoffs, and CP3, who hadn't been to the conference finals in a couple of years, and a franchise that has never won a championship. So I don't hold it against Phoenix. People are like, oh, they blew this series. It's like, well, they won the first 2 at home, and then Milwaukee won their next 2, and then Milwaukee just figured them out. And the Suns simply didn't hit enough shots. If the Suns hit a little more of you could say the same thing that the Bucks didn't shoot well from 3, but Phoenix really got to the point where they were relying on that 3-point ball. And so it just became evident that the Suns had to shoot the lights out. They had big leads in several of these games, and they just weren't able to keep them because Giannis kept coming and coming and coming and coming and coming, right? There's another debate going on about Giannis and his place in the NBA right now. Some people are like, he's the best player in the world. And I hate this best player in the world the day after the finals because most people aren't putting anything in context. And I'm not saying that Giannis isn't the best player in the world. So the best player in the world went something like this. It went from Russell and Wilt to Kareem to Magic and Bird and Moses Malone somewhere in there. Then you had Michael Jordan. And after Jordan retires the first time, it was Akeem Olajuwon. And then Jordan again. And then in the 2000s, it was Tim Duncan and Shaq and a little bit of Kobe. And then it was LeBron all the way up until a couple of years ago. Even though LeBron was in the MVP discussion last year, people would like to say, oh, well, Kawhi just won his second finals MVP. He's the best player in the world. He's past LeBron. And it's like, has he though? Best ability is availability. And Kevin Durant and Klay Thompson went down in that series. It doesn't take away from the fact. And then Kawhi won the finals MVP, averaging like 13 points a game in 2014. Once again, context. It doesn't say that Kawhi is not a great player. Now no one's talking about Kawhi being the best player in the world. And Kevin Durant comes back from the Achilles and he plays amazing. Kevin Durant's the best player in the world. And Giannis goes and drops a 50-piece, averages 35 in the finals. Giannis is the best player in the world. Like, it changes so much. And this is one of those weird times in the NBA because Father Time has caught up with LeBron and he's had 2 injuries now in the last 3 years to where there almost isn't a best player. Jokic won the MVP, but I really believe if Embiid plays most of the season, then Embiid wins the MVP. I think that LeBron he was in that conversation. I mean, the people are like, oh, he's first, second, or third in the MVP. Chris Paul was thrown in that conversation. So Giannis, and then Harden's impact as being a point guard in Brooklyn, and Kevin Durant, and Giannis now. But Steph Curry was in the MVP conversation. So I don't know if there is a best player in the NBA right now. I think it's fluid, and I think it's a good place for the league to be in where you have multiple stars. And we've talked about this before on this show about, okay, well, you have the top 7, which usually goes something like LeBron, KD, Kawhi, Steph, Giannis, Kawhi, Dame, Anthony Davis, Jokic, Embiid, and Luka. And that's not an order. That's just off the top of my head. Those are usually like the top 11 that most people agree on. And then you start throwing in guys like Booker and Tatum and Mitchell that are up and coming that can move up that ladder at some point. And so I don't think that it's too crazy to say that Giannis is in that discussion. He's got 2 MVPs and a finals MVP now, and a Defensive Player of the Year award, even though we know the holes in his game. But if teams are just going to let him do what he did to the Suns, then it's not going to matter. So we're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back after these messages.